We are delighted to have 3 members of the PAGE team from Cincinnati Children's speaking today about collaborations across the Academic Health Center, and they are just, in my mind, absolute models, the ideal models of collaborators in our Academic Health Center, and they are Drs. Leah Kotyan and Matt Wyrock and Steve Wagner. And again, they're faculty members in CAGE. They've all been highly successful investigators, and I think in part their success is due to these wonderful strategies that they have for collaboration. So I'll turn it over to them, and please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the silent applause. So my name is Matt, and I'm here with my friends Leah and Steve today. So this will be a little different because of the virtual format, but I think we'll keep this to similar to how it's gone in the past, because I think it's gone pretty well. The basic layout is we'll start just by briefly introducing ourselves and some of the work we do, and then we prepared a set of about 10 or so questions that I will kind of walk us through kind of in a panel style. And then please feel free to chime in with any questions or comments as we go. We don't really have a strong agenda here. It's more like these questions just kind of guideposts for us to follow as we move along. And so I guess if we're all ready to go, we can just get started, and I'll share my screen and hopefully that works. Cool. Okay, so I think to start, I thought maybe we just introduce ourselves, and we'll do this in alphabetical order. So Leah, why don't you go first, please?
Absolutely. So I'm Leah Kotyan, and I think it's helpful to introduce my research from the standpoint of collaboration. So I started my postdoc as a collaboration. I actually had 2 division directors as a postdoc, where I was learning to do genetic association analysis and work with next generation sequencing data with in a genomics division, while collaborating with Mark Rothenberg in allergy immunology to apply those tools to eosinophilic esophagitis. And that's been such an important collaboration for me. It's become a professional collaboration. So I'm an associate professor with tenure, but I still co-publish with Mark. We have a paper coming out in January where I'm first and he's last. And that might be one of the things we talk about is how do you do authorship with collaborations. But one of the things that I think is the most exciting part of research is that even as a PhD in immunology, I'm able to apply the most cutting edge computational approaches and other approaches, even engineering approaches, because I bring in people from other disciplines to work with me on the same problem that none of us could do by ourselves, but together we can do a lot. So I'll send it to, I guess, Steve.
So we're going by last name alphabetical, Matt?
Yes.
I'm still reeling from Jessica calling me a model, so it's yeah, no, so I'm Steve Wagner. I'm a viral immunologist, and so actually my entire life in Cincinnati has been a collaborative, serendipitous affair that I was on the job trail for divisions that would do just immunology, infectious disease, and ended up finding this group of awesome bioinformaticists and autoimmune genomics folks who have changed the way I do science. And it's been a lot of fun. And hopefully we'll get to talk about some of that today. But it's taken me into informatics, which I am the least capable of using a computer amongst all the faculty in my division, I think. And so having colleagues who can help me with all kinds of stuff that I have either forgotten or never knew how to do, and then to do things I'm really excited about, like moving from just viruses and vaccines to be able to develop therapies for autoimmune disease. Really, Children's and CAGE has been just an awesome place to do collaborative science.
All right, well, thanks, Steve. So I'll wrap up the introduction. So I'm Matt Wyrock. I'm an associate professor over in CAGE with my friends Leah and Steve here. I'm a bioinformatician by trade, so I was trained as a computer scientist, and then my PhD was in bioinformatics. So my lab, initially my initial plans were I'd just be doing computational work, and I thought that'd work for me in the past, and I'd keep doing that. But thanks to the awesome power of collaboration, I work now with Leah and Steve quite a bit, and Leah and I even share a lab, so we share an experimental lab together, which we co-direct. And, there's no way I could ever do that, having never held a pipette in my life. But, I can at least offer guidance. And I think I've learned a lot over the past few years with the wet lab. And, I think our research is thriving, largely through that collaboration. And then, one with Steve, where, the three of us have an R01 together. And then as a bioinformatician, it's an advantage because, I really get to collaborate with many people on virtually any topic. Like if you look at my recent publications, I have one that's, studying insect genomics. And, most of my work ends up, being in human health, of course, because I work at a hospital, but a lot of the computational tools that we build can be applied to pretty much any form of life, because at some level, biology is a fundamental principle that guides all of life. So, collaboration is a huge part of my life, and, I don't know where I'd be without it, but I'm sure happy that I do it all the time. And, hopefully today we can help everyone at least have some new ideas about how they can increase the amount of collaboration they do and be more successful in that way. So I think that's pretty good introduction. So why don't we get started? So I think we actually already did this, but Leah and Steve, if either of you have anything to add, the topic is briefly share your current scholarly collaborations and successes. I guess we didn't really get into details yet. So either of you, whoever would like to start, just go right ahead.
Yeah, I'll add to what I already said, which is a lot of times in our lab, we develop experimental techniques and pipelines that we work on for 1, 2, 3, 4 years. And then once they start working, one of my favorite things to do is to go talk to people who come to my research talks and talk about how to apply it to their system. So an example of that is we've recently developed this massively parallel reporter assay system that Aaron Zorn's group was very excited about, and we were able to get them using that system within a couple of months, where we had spent about 3 years developing it. And another example would just be with the experimental ChIP-seq chromatin immunoprecipitation followed by sequencing, and ATAC-seq, where you look at where in the genome is available for transcription factors to come and bind. We were able to, after we optimized it in our lab, invite other people into our lab to literally learn from us and our technicians, and then take it back to their lab. And that's one of my favorite things that I think has been rather successful.
Yeah, and I think something I would add too is that I think one kind of trick to being a good collaborator is like doing one thing really well, and then you become, you get a reputation of that person that does that thing. And when someone else is doing research, locally or even nationally, and they need that thing, then they know to go to you. So for me, like that thing has just been gene regulation and transcription factors. And, much of my lab, again, there's an advantage to being computational, but I don't think you have to be computational. Where, that's kind of a topic that, we're experts in. And, it happens to be a fairly broad topic that's important for many different systems. But I'd say, at least half of my collaborations just stem from like word of mouth, where it's like, people get to like figure 5 in the paper they're working on, and they're like, oh, it looks like transcription factors might be involved. And then, they send me a note and ask if I can help. And then it's nice because, for one thing, we do know what we're doing on that topic. And then for another thing, we pretty much have established protocols on what to do, where it's like, if Collaborator has this problem, then we do this analysis. If Collaborator has that problem, then we do that analysis. So it's almost like a protocol. So it makes things easier for us. So with a minimal amount of effort, we can, deliver, really like the best possible aid to our collaborators. But, again, the point is that it's not a huge amount of work for us because, we focus on the one thing we're good at, and, applying it to different problems isn't very hard. So you've kind of nailed down your protocols and what you want to do. And I think that it holds experimentally too, as well. Maybe I'll let Steve or Leah kind of comment on that.
I don't think I have too much to add. I was trying to think a little bit about, I guess a lot of the people on this call would be on the clinical side. So I usually share how awesome it's been at Children's as a basic scientist, being able to collaborate with clinicians. But I suspect a lot of this audience would be looking to go the opposite direction. And so I think what Matt said is a good idea in terms of having expertise that people know to bring to you. Certainly, like mine is being able to apply mouse models and understand immunology and include different virus and infectious models in those systems, and to dissect those very complex systems to answer questions that are relevant to different people. So a lot of my collaborations stem from that, or from identifying something in mice that brings me to a clinician saying, hey, I think this might be something important in your patients that nobody's ever looked for, and being able to start collaborations that way, which sometimes end in, well, we can't get the material from our patients you need, or here's a really cool idea, let's pursue it together.
Steve, I think that's a really great point. So maybe I can give one of my collaborations with a clinician that has been super successful, that is a way that you might think of modeling a collaboration. So we do a lot of work on immune cells, and some of the immune cells we like to study are pretty rare in peripheral blood. So we have our own IRBs and ways to get patient blood from patients with different diseases. But one of the things we started realizing is we needed lots, like we're talking millions of some cells that we just can't get from the blood. So in a discussion with one of my clinical colleagues, Dave Smith, who is an ENT in the sleep clinic, he started mentioning that at Children's Hospital, we do thousands of tonsillectomies every year, and we just throw them away. And I said, really? Is there any way we could get those? And so we actually worked together for about, I would say, 6 or 7 months, developed an IRB. He had the expertise to have the clinical research coordinators that were already in his division that could help with some of the logistics and the working with human subjects and bringing people in. And we came up with a system where my technicians, or Steve's, I don't know, Steve, if you send people to, or if our group gives them to you, but between Steve and I, we send an ice bucket with a 50 mil conical of media with a little bit of human serum in it, and we're able to get pieces of tonsils that we're able to process within hours and get really important cells that we need for our studies, making Dave and his team co-authors on our papers because he certainly contributed to them. And it's been, I think, very fortuitous on both of our sides.
Agreed.
Yep, and that was the birth of Tonsil Tuesdays. At one point, we kept getting tonsils so much that it was like almost a weekly thing.
This was exciting for Tuesday.
Yeah. I would add too that just this morning, Leah and I were on in a meeting, virtual meeting, where we realized that we really need to find clinical experts for certain diseases we're studying. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse being computational, where you can study virtually anything. The curse being that you're really, you often don't know a lot about what you're studying. So that's a great time for a clinician, that's an expert on a certain disease or category of diseases, to reach out to them and see if they're interested in the science you're doing, and to make sure that you fully understand, the phenotype and, what actually is going to matter in terms of, even all the way to treating the patients. Okay. If there's no comments or questions, then I think we'll move on to the next slide, if that's fine with everyone. So there it is. Okay, so the next topic is a question, and it's, how did you develop your collaborations, and what are the lessons learned along the way? Parenthesis, what worked and what didn't, close parenthesis. Steve or Leah, would you like to start, or I can do it myself if you don't answer within the next 3 seconds?
We'll let you go, Matt.
Oh man, they called my bluff. Okay, so I would say there's no single answer in terms of, the first part of the question is how did collaborations develop? I think a lot of it is, when I was more junior, there was a lot of reaching out. So it was, hello, I'm a new assistant professor here, and my research is, focuses on gene regulation and transcription factors, and I've heard that you're working on a similar problem. And would you be willing to meet to briefly discuss, our research programs and perhaps find synergy and identify collaborations we can work on? As time's gone on, like, I've kind of gained more of a reputation, like I mentioned before, where, at least most people locally, it's a small enough community that people have at least a bullet point idea of what I do. At least a lot of people do. And so people start coming to me more often, or like someone, passes a collaborator, a current collaborator of mine passes a new one to me, things like that. So I think local word of mouth is a really good one. I think on a broader scale, it's challenging now, with the pandemic, but attending, meetings, at a national and even international scale can really help. I found that, especially kind of like stalking poster sessions is a good way. If there's, really specific expertise that you need, and your attention. So like ASHG, the American Society of Human Genetics, is a major conference that we attend basically yearly. But if there's a particular research topic that have found your way heading this way in your research, and you really want to find, there's only a handful of world experts on that topic. Poster sessions and other sessions like that, like more social functions at these large meetings, can often be really useful for tracking down the right expertise and perhaps starting collaborations. Because I think an important thing to consider is just collaborations are two ways. So it's, you might have your expert thing that you can do to help someone else. And I think I end up doing that a lot more often, but also there's often people that, have an expertise that could help you. And like, again, like Leah and Steve are perfect examples of people that fall into that category for me. And I think it's a two-way street, obviously, or I guess three-way street, but anyways, we all help each other. So, so I think developing collaborations, being proactive, I think helps a lot. And then even like just asking questions.
I'm going to jump in on that now, because I was going to say it's a bit of a double-edged sword too, right? Because none of us have enough time to add a whole bunch of things to our schedule. And but I think one of the most important things is I think we all prioritize. I think it's generally true that we prioritize and value meetings with people that think like we do, that have the same concerns and the same cares. But that's actually almost counterproductive to developing collaborations, right? If I only go and listen to other people that are viral immunologists talk about viruses and immune cells that I care about, like I go to a meeting that's every 18 months that's all NK cells all the time, and we all love NK cells, but it's a lot harder to find collaborators because we're all sort of also competitors and we work on the same thing and we think and have trained inside the same box. And so I think what Matt's alluding to is one great way to find collaborators that accelerate and amplify your research and that you can amplify theirs is to find people from outside the box. But that's tricky because it means finding the time to maybe attend seminars or to go to sessions at meetings like Matt was just talking about that aren't necessarily directly already in your wheelhouse, but are the things that are just a little bit outside of it or even really far outside of it, where you can hear about new things like that tool or that idea is really useful for me to bring back into my field because it could actually change the way we think about and do things.
Yeah.
I'll just add the what didn't work part. I can tell you that I have found that collaborations that don't work, usually one of the reasons that a collaboration that I'm trying to develop doesn't work is either when I misunderstand the person I'm trying to collaborate's expertise or when they misunderstand mine. So when somebody comes to me and says, Leah, you are amazing, you know everything computational ever, come help me work on this single cell data set. I've now learned to say, hey, I'm computational, but I'm primarily experimental. And I don't do single cell data sets. Why would you want to work with me? So when someone asks you to collaborate on something you don't have expertise in, that is going to be much, much harder than when someone's asking to collaborate in your sweet spot, that area where you can do those experiments in and out, day in and day out. So I think one of the things that is especially important when you're first starting is to try to have your independent research be a primary part of what you're doing, and then to carve out a room for collaborating inside of your sweet spot of what you're good at doing. Because if you're trying to innovate and learn and optimize inside your collaboration, it's going to pull away from what you're trying to do independently, where you should be kind of stretching yourself.
I think another thing I would add too in the category of what didn't work is having too many collaborations simultaneously, because that's just inevitably going to end up to with, oh, like 5 of my collaborators have deadlines and they're all tomorrow. Well, I can't meet all 5 of those, and I'm often find myself in that position, to be honest, because every project has a different timeline and different demands that come and go. And another, threat of that is, these longer term projects, you can keep putting them off because there's deadlines with the other ones. And then next thing you know, it's been a year. And like you said, you do something, you still haven't done it yet. So I think kind of like closely monitoring, your own, multitasking ability and just like, workload level. And also, is your lab, as you have more and more people working for you, like monitoring their multitasking capability and their workload capability and their ability to meet deadlines and deal with the pressure of that. It's an ongoing thing, and there's no real right solution to it. But I think the key is acknowledging that that's a major issue and, not just, saying yes to everything. 'Cause, for a long time, my strategy was like anyone that walked in my door, I said, of course, I'd love to work with you. And I still do that probably more than I should, but it's just out of necessity. It's counterproductive to have 100 collaborations and 90 of your collaborators are mad at you. So it's something that you need to keep in mind. Expanding too fast can be a problem, I guess.
Yeah, I think very briefly after that, I think sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes you find the perfect collaborator and you can't wait to get started, but you both realize that what you want to do is not quite there yet, and you got to put that collaboration back on the shelf for a while and just have being candid in that conversation that, like, look, the next 12 months is all about me getting this particular story done. I have to publish that. It's central to what I'm going to do. And what you propose is really, really exciting, but could we shelve it till 2022? Could we maybe meet from time to time just to make sure the idea is still there, but not let the ball start rolling yet? It's important not to just like neglect the things that could be good but just aren't there yet, but also not to let them consume you, as Leah pointed out. You sort of got to put them in their place. I have at least two of those where I meet twice a year with somebody and we keep talking about a collaboration that hasn't started yet, but we're both really excited about it. But it's not in either one of our bandwidths at the moment.
Agreed.
I'm too consumed by Matt and Leah taking up all my
yeah,
time.
we're too busy bugging Steve and taking all his time. So are there anything else to add, you guys? I think we can maybe move on to the next topic. Okay, next topic.
And for those of you out there in the audience, don't be afraid to jump in. Like if you're like, hey, this was a problem I had. I'd be delighted to hear from you guys too. Don't be shy.
Yes, it's a great point because we have some slides, but I think in practice when we've done this in the past, even if you don't get through all the questions, you pretty much cover them all anyways, because there's a lot of this going on while we kind of think about our answers. So anyways, this next one is as follows. So how do you manage and prioritize independent investigations and ongoing collaborative work? So I can start on that just because I think N is largest for me. Like I think I honestly do have about maybe 100 collaborations. And it's going to sound odd perhaps, but I literally just have a spreadsheet where there's like one row per project. And I kind of just have a column where I can sort based on what stage that project is currently at. So, the highest level is, the paper's in press. And, those sort to the top and it's like, okay, we made it. And then once the paper shows up in PubMed, I remove it. And then all the way down to the lowest level is, we've met and we've discussed ideas. And I think maybe someone's doing something somewhere. And then everywhere in between, you can go all the way from papers in press to papers in revision to papers in review to just making a final push to submit the paper to we have a strong rough draft in place. So that way at least gives me a bird's eye view of things. And I still can forget about things, but having that at least make sure I have, I'm a kind of person that likes to just have some broad sense of everything that's going on, even if it's literally just a bullet point like that, where it's a single row in a spreadsheet with the name of the PI and maybe a name of the contact person, and then a working title of the paper or what you want to call the project. So that's helped me a lot. And I think even when I started my lab and the number was closer to 10 collaborations instead of 100, it still helped me a lot. So I think that's something that's good for just not just keeping track of things, but for prioritizing. I kind of moved away from this, but at one point I also had columns that like one was for like priority and like one, so like more important projects I kind of could sort to the top. And then the other was, urgency, which is like, oh, like this thing has a deadline next week. So that gets the highest score versus other thing is a longer term project. So it's a low urgency. Because I think like priority, I guess I should say importance, importance and urgency are two different things because you can have a really urgent thing where it's like, oh, I need to sign this thing and turn it in tomorrow, but it's probably not super important. Whereas you can have a long-term project that's very important, but it's not urgent because it's a long-term thing. So I guess, in short, I think organization is important. That's one system I have. And then the second system is just for each project, I guess there's three systems. For the second system is I have a Word document where I can just free write anything I want about any of these projects. And again, there's kind of like one section for each project. And that's nice because it can be challenging fitting everything into a single row in a spreadsheet. This just gives you more. You can just type freeform and things like that. Like, oh, don't forget to email Steve tomorrow about this. And then the last one is every project has its own Word document, which is where the whole game plan can be outlined and the latest updates. So I can always refer to that project's Word document, which is in its own directory. And the directories I name by the PIs, the name of the collaborator is PI, because that's something that almost never changes, right? If you're working on a project, I'm working on a project with Leah, then I know I can always just look under her name for that project. Whereas like a grad student or a postdoc, they might actually, leave the lab, and finish, and then someone else is working on it. Or, I hate to say it, but sometimes you might forget the name of, if it's like an undergrad that you barely met that's leading the project, you might not remember their name as easily as the PI. So the PI is a stable, fairly memorable thing to name the project of. And I think that's good because also the name of the projects could change. You might start a project with this as the scope, and then by the end, it's way over here. So that's something that also changes, but the PI name just won't change. So that's kind of a lot of logistics. But that's
I
a
have
system that
I
I've
have some
developed.
strategic parts.
Yep.
So one of the things that I think is important, and I know that at least one person on this call I meet with regularly, so she probably already knows this, but like I am a very just like take a step back and think about strategically, where do you want to be in a year? And at especially an early stage level, that's actually pretty clear. You need funding and you need publications. And so if you start with where do I need to be in a year, and you want to do impactful science, and you want to stay true to your scientific values, where do you want to be doing that science? And so I try to start with that and then just be really honest with myself about what is feasible. So there might be a project I'm working on independently that I know is going to come to fruition in 2 years, but is not going to have papers in between that. That's when I'll start going to Matt and saying, hey, can I contribute to this manuscript that I know is coming up that I might be able to do a lot for and earn authorship on as a collaborator and get a really nice publication while I'm still working on the 2-year goal. If I know I have a grant coming up or a grant submission coming up, I will prioritize that because that's what I need to breathe as a scientist. An example would be I'm going to resubmit an R01 in March. So in February, I'm not going to start new collaborations. I'm not going to give 90% of my time to even really cool collaborators of mine because I need to be putting my energy into getting my R01 renewed so that my lab is safe, that I can continue to be a great collaborator in the summer and fall. And I think sometimes taking a big step back and looking at that timeline, you guys probably put in your K grant of this is what I plan to do here, this is what I plan to do there. A lot of times those timelines go out the window. COVID certainly messed up a lot of them. But if you were thinking that you're going to be putting a K grant in this for the NIH this summer, then you need to make sure that on your calendar, there is time in your day you can be thinking about the science and refining your aims. And if you have that, that's great. Then carve out different time to be doing a collaboration. And that's one of the things that I think about more strategically.
I would just add having a, to Matt's organizational scheme, having something that's more shared is also very helpful. I like Slack a lot. Matt and Leah are big into like having a Google or wiki that their lab can go to. I know there's like different systems, but the problem with email, right, is like there's constantly going to be things in your inbox that are priority, and things it just keeps scrolling down away from you, the things you need to get to. And so the nice thing I like about Slack is I can sort of put out a new message of, hey, I just read this paper. We thought about doing this experiment, and it goes to not only my team members, but the team members in the lab I'm collaborating with and the collaborator. And it just keeps everything in one place. But it doesn't matter what it is, like whatever your thing is, I think it's good to have some sort of shared method that's not based on email, because email everyone who experiences this just finds email eventually to be flawed, other than maybe Leah, because she's perpetually better organized than everybody. But for the rest of us, right, I think it's nice to have that system that everyone can go to, and it's like separate from the other system that dominates our life.
Even I cannot make our CCHMC Outlook email work for me. And so what Matt and I neither of us said, because frankly, it's a little bit cheating because we have a almost full-time person who makes it work, is that we keep a wiki page for our lab, that every project has a wiki where all the data is there. So we literally can send our collaborators a link and they can get to their data that we have made for them. All of our project plans, our goals, every meeting we restart by going to that wiki page so that we can all remind ourselves, why are we doing this? What is the purpose? And that might be a really good, probably lead into probably what's another question is that if you're collaborating with somebody who collaborates a lot, like if you're collaborating with Matt or really with me for sure, you need to start the meeting with, what are we talking about today? What question are we trying to solve? Because while that might be super obvious to you, if you have 1 or 2 projects, when you go over 20 projects, 30 projects, it actually is very unobvious. And we remember we liked you. We remember we were working together, and we could probably give about 5 sentences that make sense. But it will take 30 minutes to get into a meeting, as opposed to if you can just start out with, okay, let's center ourselves.
Yeah, I think that centering thing is huge, where it's literally just, we're all here because of this. And like it might feel stupid, but trust me, it's totally worth it. Just say, we're here for this. Here's our current hypothesis. Here's where we currently are. Today, we're going to talk about this and try and figure this out. And then when you do that, it doesn't have to be exactly that sentence, but something like that at the top of every meeting. Like, I haven't tracked it, but I just, if you could, categorize a collaborative meeting into successful or not successful, I think the ones that start with that, brief, like literally 1 minute debriefing at the very top, like those are the successful ones. And the ones that don't just easily just get aimless and they start waffling and people just start talking for talking's sake.
And Matt, it looks like there's a question in the chat that maybe you can answer or later.
Yeah, I'm sharing my screen, and it's going to take me 10 minutes of bungling to try and find it. So if someone else could tell me,
I will do the questions. You continue, and I'll do questions. Okay. By a wiki page, do you mean like a SharePoint? So we literally have a wiki page. I have used a SharePoint. SharePoints were bulkier. I thought that wikis were going to be too complicated, but we literally use a wiki page where you use a hashtag for a number and it numbers things. I'm dizzied by all the tools. I quit Slack Teams because of pandemic-wise. It seemed like everyone went there, and those docs go to SharePoint. I'm having trouble knowing how to organize these tools. And that's one of those things where I think you do have to try different things and figure out what works for you, and then just announce, this is how I work. I am on some Slack channels, but I don't do Slack. And I tell people that. I'm very honest with them. And our wiki page, it's just a place, a SharePoint site can work very similarly, but for our wiki page, I think you can also do it through Teams, but I like our wiki page because we literally will embed Excel files with raw results. We'll put in figures. We'll like literally, you can search it really easily. Matt, the computational thing is built upon.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing that Wikipedia is built on. It's all open source, and it probably takes some savvy to set it up, but they have pretty clear documentation on how to set up your own. And ours has grown pretty sophisticated and complicated, but I mean, honestly, setting up your own wiki, it's not that hard to do if you can follow instructions. And it's something to consider. And at least if you can just build a little simple one yourself, then it's just, if you use it, it grows. And ours just, I've never counted, but it's probably like millions of words in it now between all the things going on.
One of the things I caught in there too, and I think it's in your answer as well, is it doesn't matter which one of these things you pick to organize, but any one of them you don't pay enough attention to, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I think that's a key point.
The thing you're going to feed and over and over again and go back to, whatever that is, that's what'll work. And it's the same for like when most of us did filing by paperwork, like when I used to print every PDF. I had to have a system for like putting those in a stack, and nobody else understood my system. But as long as I knew which part of the stack to go to when I needed a paper, it was a good system for me.
Yep. Yeah, I think just coming to the realization you should have some sort of system is step one, and then it just becomes just try a bunch out and yeah, for us, it took us like almost a year for the wiki to really catch fire, but now it's just something that we use literally on an hourly basis, I would say.
And I will say that the wet lab part of our group is the one that probably drug our feet the most. And it took me going in and saying, hey guys, this isn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. Look, I just did this. And now we have RA2, so research assistant twos that are coming directly out of college, who we just are the way our lab works is you wiki. And so they learn to wiki their first week. And it's not like learning R or learning SAS. It literally is just learning just a couple, like, just do free text. This is not Word, and it works.
Yeah, it's closer to Microsoft Word, plus you need to learn a couple little tricks. So once the system's up, it's actually pretty easy. And then you can get super fancy, and like you can have like sub bullet points, and they can automatically populate. I haven't even figured out how to do that, but I know you can. Okay, so then are there any other things we should I think this is an important topic. I kind of blabbed a lot at the beginning. We talked about Slack and Wiki. Is there anything we're leaving out? Okay, so I think then I'll move on to the next one. Okay, the next one. Have your collaborations been formalized in some way? And if so, how has that process occurred?
So I'll start that if you don't mind. I think I think it's important to formalize collaborations. As soon as there's expectations that someone's doing something for you or you're doing something for someone else, I would encourage you to formalize that really fast. And the way I do it is both verbally and with a follow-up email, just so that we're all on the same page. So I formalized things like, we're going to do this together. If this becomes a manuscript, you're going to be an author on this because you would have contributed. Or if I'm doing something for them, I'll say, I expect to be an author, and anybody who's in my group who contributes to this is going to be an author on this. I need you to make sure you're going to cite my grants. Here's a couple of examples, but obviously we'll follow that up later. And I send that email literally the day after we have our first discussion where they're asking something tangible. So it's not a, do you want to work together? Sure. It's a, will you do this ChIP-seq experiment for my lab? I say, sure, I'll follow that up with an email. And then I even go as far as, so we're going to send that for sequencing, and we're going to send you a note later telling you how much that was, and we'll do a cost share between our divisions. And I will say that in 2014, when I was first an assistant professor, that was a terrifying email, and I didn't send it often enough, and I didn't send it early enough, and it got me into trouble because there were misunderstandings about if something was a collaboration or not, about if somebody was going to pay for something or I was going to pay for something. And so I think really setting up expectations, even in terms of time. So I told Hector Wong that our lab's going to do some sequencing of employee coronavirus testing results. And I told him literally in November, I said, I expect that we're going to have data back in January, but I'll update you, because I didn't want there to be a misunderstanding that, oh, Leah's magical, she's great, she's going to have data tomorrow. And I don't know if he would have had that expectation, but by telling him, don't expect to hear results until mid-January, I was very clear about what I at least thought was how long it was going to take. And just anything you can do to be transparent and clear, I think will help the relationship for forever. I would also suggest that the way to another part of formalizing it is putting limits on it, putting boundaries on it. Do not walk into a lifelong sharing a lab collaboration as the first thing you do with somebody, even if you think they're a really cool person. The first thing Matt and I did together was agree we were going to co-direct one research technician. You want to make sure that you're not walking into a collaboration that you're going to want to get out of that doesn't have a good stopping point. So having kind of boundaries, I think, is also important.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's a little less applicable internally. But when you have collaborations outside, I'm dealing with this right now. There are some formal things you can do to formalize them in terms of you can get collaborative agreements put in place where you can freely share data back and forth, and it's clear between the two institutions who owns the data and the rights to the data and who's just using it as a collaborator. We have a story where we used a real cool new genomics technique, and both us and the other lab want to publish it, and we're excited about the data, but neither one of us knew when we started the project that a company that neither one of us is in charge of has some hold on the technique. And they're actually now currently blocking us from publication. And we've had multiple different meetings about this. And that's not meant to be a horror story, but we just never knew. We never formalized the collaboration at the beginning because we were friends and very excited about pursuing the idea together. and none of us knew to put anything on paper that would have protected us from this third party that actually is able to exert a lot of influence now because there was never a formalized collaboration agreement.
Yeah.
So it's good to put those things into place, and they're not required, so a lot of people bypass that step. But having them in place gives you some assurance that your role in the collaboration is protected.
I totally agree. Like I tend to be a more informal person, and it can feel awkward, but literally in this past year, I've had one case where, I found out that there's a paper that's on bioRxiv now where literally my work led to the title of that paper, and I'm not a co-author on it. It's like, okay, that's a surprise. And then on the other hand, literally this year, I've found a paper that was published that had my name on it that I didn't even see. Like I didn't even know it existed. Like it just stemmed from, a meeting that we had once. And I guess they felt that I offered enough advice that I should be a co-author. But, I'll be fine in both cases, but they make for awkward situations. And I think both of those could have been fixed had we been very upfront about what our expectations were for the collaboration. Be they authorship. In the first case, I think I should be an author since I contributed fundamentally to the whole point of the paper. And for the second one, I don't like having my name on papers that I've never even read. I think to me that's obvious, but maybe it's not obvious to others.
No, that's a really good point, Matt, because there's some people that just think anything you get that's a positive is a positive. And that can be bad sometimes if people just gift you authorship because that might not be ethical. You might not want to be on those papers if the data themselves are not ethical. There's nothing worse than being stuck with a retraction when you thought you got rewarded with a paper. Things like that. So I think it's really important to, and I think there was a question in the chat about a scorecard. Authorship gets to be really tricky, but what Leah said at the beginning of setting out, at least if you know that it's a senior author, who the senior author is it a co-senior author, and who the first author is, I think figuring out all those middle authors gets really tricky. I don't know if a scorecard system, things change pretty dynamically. Sometimes when you write a paper, there's a minor player that becomes the major player during the revision stage.
Yep.
So those can get really tricky, but at least if you set out at the beginning that this is my group's paper, I'm the senior author on this, I have an important role in this, and this is the student that's directing the whole project, you have a good place to start from that you don't need to worry about like a final score. Like you shouldn't get to the point of a manuscript and be scoring up how much each person did to decide where they go in the author list. It doesn't work very well that way.
I think having a plan and then perhaps revisiting that plan towards the point of submission is probably the best. I think that's what you're saying, right? Where it's like, you should have expectations going in with the understanding that perhaps not everyone's going to carry their weight as planned for various reasons, and perhaps someone's going to end up bearing much more of the work and doing more leadership or whatever. So it should be flexible, but I think as early as possible, trying to set up at least, if all goes according to plan, you're first author, I'll be last author, and you might be co-first author if you really rise to the challenge, and you'll probably be the third author.
I think in a lot of collaborative studies, it tends to be like one lab gets the senior author spot and the other lab gets the first author spot. At least having that worked out between the two labs ahead of time solves a lot of headaches about how you're going to manage that.
The other thing that can be really helpful and probably helpful to people on this call is that it's important to model the appropriate behavior about talking about authorship. So when you're worried that authorship is wrong, what I really try to model in front of people in our lab, and so that they know the words to use, they even know the words to use to question an authorship thing, is what could I, if someone's not on an author who wants to be an author, we're teaching them to say, what can I have done? This is what I think I contributed to the manuscript. What more could I do for this manuscript to earn authorship is an example. Another example that I've used personally is, well, this is how I contributed to this manuscript. I list the things I think I did. And I say, so I think that I should have I should probably be second author on this manuscript. What do you think? And teaching people to have that conversation without emotion, just, putting facts out there. Maybe I've never used a scorecard, but just in terms of this is what I contributed, this is what you contributed, and doing that with the senior authors as being an appropriate way to do it, as opposed to the passive, like going outside of the office after the meeting's over and just complaining about it, or going around to your other mentor and saying, well, they, didn't let me have authorship or messed up my authorship. And so having really frank conversations in front of trainees and in front of the entire team, and teaching your trainees and your other collaborators to do that will help you not run into major problems. I can say I haven't had really any major problems in the last few years, especially since we've kind of put together a team that does that, I think, really well.
I think one thing I'd add too is authorship position means different things to different people, because it depends on the career stage for one thing. It depends on the culture of the field for another thing. And, so by that, I mean, like my wife's a geologist, and in her field, even the faculty members would much rather be third author than last author. And that's just because they kind of do a totally different system from what we do in medicine, where it's like, it's a ranking where it's like, first author is most important, second author is second most, third is third most. So if you're last author there, it means you contributed the least. And it's like, I'm not saying you're going to run around collaborating with geologists, but I think there are subtle differences where, like in the genomics field, for me, at least like faculty, you want to be the last author if you're in charge of things. It means that you're in charge. But I know I've collaborated with multiple clinicians where often a very senior clinician will be the first author. And, I think it all just depends on some of the cultural things and also just, where you are in your career. So it's important because sometimes, and the reason I bring this up is because sometimes you can negotiate, like, if you're on a paper where there's 3 major people that contributed, there's really only 2 major positions, first and last, but often you can kind of figure out, well, maybe the third person would be better as co-last or co-first, and you can kind of work things out that way. And that's, again, it's about communication, where if you can establish, I think I've done this, so I have earned a prominent place. If I had my choice, I would like to be last. And then someone else can say, well, I think I've been prominent too. If I have my choice, I think I should be co-first. And then you can kind of go from there. Steve, did you have anything to add?
I was saying it was good that Leah said to keep emotion out of it, because it does get to be a complicated issue. And you need to protect yourself up front and as early as you can. And I like Leah's suggestion of how you approach if you feel like there's something wrong with authorship. But sometimes there's just no easy solution. And so, probably the best solution when there's not an easy solution is to negotiate the best position you can, and then make sure it's clear that, you don't have to say it, but it's usually very clear to everybody involved that, Steve got the short end on that paper because there just wasn't a way to resolve it, but we're going to make sure that doesn't happen the next time. And, people, no one's ever looking to screw you, but sometimes the politics of a situation are just bad, and there's no resolving them. People will then look for ways in the future to make sure that you kind of get yours, and it doesn't become just a perpetual thing, because nobody wants collaborations. Just, I don't want to collaborate with you anymore. I never get the authorship I deserve. They're going to want to fix that.
Also, just remember that internally at our institution, and I send my internal CV out, we actually have an opportunity to specifically speak to what our contributions to manuscripts are. And so even if you're next to last, for example, you can specifically enumerate exactly what your contribution was.
But yeah, I think how many of you are still at a tricky stage where I think that the hardest stage is when to decide when to start going from like first, second author to like when you should be last. And that can be a very tricky thing, because obviously when you're trying to get an R01, they're looking for like people that have established programs and are last author. But obviously you also have to build up some of that first author street cred. So that can actually be trickier sometimes, that first negotiation of when you're the one who did the work, but you kind of want to move into a senior corresponding author position on something.
Yeah.
Maybe really, I don't have a specific solution, but if any of you have this problem, you should chat with some people that have been through it and see how they negotiated it.
All right. So then why don't we move on to the next?
Let people see if anybody has questions, because we probably have time to discuss one more topic. So maybe if there's anybody who has a question, we can answer that.
Yeah, why don't you take it out of presenter mode, Matt, so they can see the questions too? Like, can you do that?
Well, I'll just give, we have questions about how do you be a good collaborator? What are bad collaborators? How do you get out of collaborations? We can talk about almost anything for the next 7 minutes, and then we have to go. And you do too.
A quick thought I would have, I think the discussion about authorship was really fantastic. I would just encourage you all to try to establish authorship before you even as you're planning the analyses, as opposed to waiting until everything's done and then looking at everyone's contributions. The earlier you spell that out, the less likely you are to get into trouble in the end, and put all that down in writing. So establishing authorship teams and order, before you even start doing the analyses can be really helpful.
Sometimes
agree with everything that everyone said about when you get to the end and you see the author order and you're not happy with it, negotiating is important, but sometimes you can prevent that by establishing it up early.
Jessica, I would just add, sometimes even before the project starts, not even before you do the analysis, but like if this is going to be a key project to your lab and your future pursuits, it almost needs to be set up front that, hey, if things break right on this, I'd really like this to be a central paper where I'm like the contributing senior corresponding author on it, and put that out there at the beginning. I think people are more open to it at the beginning than at the end. Yep. I'm sure Leah, Matt, and I are all involved in collaborations where I'm just happy to have my name stamped anywhere in the pile because it's not that important to me. But there's collaborations where I know where I should be and how important the project is to me. And those I like to state that up front, where I think we're going to be at the end of the day.
The only other thing I think I do want to say, because it's important to this group, is that when I was at your level, I specifically went to some of my mentors and I asked them to sponsor me. And I think you guys have probably talked about the difference between mentorship and sponsorship. But for example, I asked John Harley, I said, you know what? I've driven this project. I would like to be the senior last author, and you probably have rights to it. You could tell me, nope, you need to be first author. But I think that being last author would be something that would be incredibly valuable to my career, and it's something that I would like. And he said yes. Mark Rothenberg also said yes to me on several manuscripts, where one could have, at the beginning, the expectation that we really didn't talk about enough was that I was probably going to be first and they were going to be last, because that's standard when you're a postdoc or a brand new faculty. But by just making that ask, I didn't insist upon it, but they saw that opportunity to sponsor me, and it made a huge difference when I was going after extramural grants and people started looking at me, especially in the context of someone who is so collaborative. Even today, with as many grants as I have, I get study section feedback. Well, where is your authorship? Why is it like this? And I can respond to that. But one of the best ways is because the teams that I work with I trust them because they've sponsored me in the past and helped me have authorship positions that I certainly earned, but could have been argued to be someone else's.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm screwing up the screen here, but I can move Leah away and we can read the next question. Okay, have some collaborations started small and grown to be significantly larger, broader? My answer is yes.
Yeah, probably a simple one we can skip over since we only got a few minutes.
All right. And there's 2 left. So let me move Steve out of the way. Get out of there, Steve. What are some of the results of your collaborations that you don't think could have been accomplished independently? All of them, every paper ever. I don't think I have any single author papers.
I think the key thing to point out there might be, again, for a group of people that are young and coming through the pipeline, is I know when I was at that level, I wanted to do everything. Like if I was going to start doing ChIP-seq and K-cells, I wanted to be the one with my own hands that got trained in how to do ChIP-seq and learned how to do it. And I learned the bioinformatic analysis. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that approach, but I think also coming back to that idea of managing your time and expectations, realizing when it's better for you to just say, hey, your lab is really good at this. I don't want you to just generate data and hand it to me, but would you guys agree to be the drivers of this and talk me through how we're generating the data, how to design the experiment, how best to do this, and if we're doing the right thing. And so sort of making that realization that you don't need to be doing everything yourself and bringing every single bit of technology into your own lab, but valuing the fact that the other people probably spent multiple years getting that down, and you're not going to just pick it up in a month and run with it. I think it's easy to forget that sometimes it took people years to establish a technique, and it's not that easy to pass off to someone else.
Yeah, I think that's an important point for collaborations, which is we find ourselves doing this a lot too, where it's like, oh, this is a new experimental technology we'd like to bring into our lab. But often it's easier just to keep it in your collaborators' lab since they already have it working. And maybe long term you'd like to bring it in, but you have to keep in mind the time frame where, in our experience, it takes about a year to bring any new experimental type effectively into the lab and have it up and going. Whereas if you have a collaborator that's doing it on a weekly basis, you'll get data much quicker just, having them do that.
Yeah, it's easier to do when you have a big enough lab that you can say, hey, you, grad student number 2, you really want this technique for your thesis. Why don't you go to that person's lab for the next few weeks, hammer it out, bring it back, and you'll establish it in our lab. And before you leave, you'll teach the next person how to do it. And then it becomes part of your lab's culture. But if you only have one person, you don't want to lose them to learning a technique for a month when no one else in your lab can generate data for you. So I really I think your ability to broaden out and learn new techniques comes as you start having, I don't want to ever call them expendable, but you have more effort of your people than you have a moment in time things that need done. So you can start having some of those people use their effort to bring in new things that you didn't already have. Like master's students is a really good place to do that. They usually don't have salary demands. They have like a 1-year project that's not really about taking something from A to Z. Then maybe you can just use them to bring something new into your lab that you don't already do by allowing them to go off and train somewhere else and come back and learn that technique.
So we have 1 minute, so maybe we can do any closing remarks. And I will pass it to Dr. Kadian for the first closing remark if you have any.
Well, it's been really nice to be here. I wish we could have been in person where we could have been a little bit more back and forth, but I appreciate the opportunity, and I think you should collaborate. Start small.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I'm going to say start small. You should collaborate.
There you go.
Steve,
there's no way to cover all of this, all of our collective expertise, and we don't just. I don't even say expertise, or that Matt Lee and I know how this works. We just spend a lot of time talking about it with each other, with our other collaborators, with people like you. And I think we learn from the more we talk about it, what works and what doesn't. And so if you guys have other questions and comments, just come find us, either individually, schedule a Zoom call with all 3 of us. We just love those because we enjoy being together, and it's nice having new friends.